Hello, 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 and welcome back to IVF in Your Pocket, your waiting room companion. Before we go into today's episode about what to do to kind of explore your chances of having success when IVF doesn't work, I want to take a minute and talk about my newish workshop, From Overwhelm to Confidence. If you are starting IVF or in the middle of your IVF journey and lost, or you know someone who is struggling on their IVF journey, I really encourage you to point them or check out yourself my new IVF workshop that is extremely comprehensive and thorough. You can go ahead and find the link to that in the show notes. And today's episode is all about what you can explore. What are some of the top things that come up for people when IVF hasn't worked for them? And I'm going to divide the episode into two parts. The first part is looking to the 5 things to think about if you had a retrieval that didn't go your way. And then the last part of the episode is 5 things to look at if transfer didn't go your way. And again, I am not a medical provider, and this is a spicy episode. I'm going to be covering some controversial things. So I'm going to be looking at some experimental things that people explore and think about when IVF doesn't work. Again, these are not necessarily standard medical procedures or what maybe most REs would prescribe to or support. So just so you know, some of these things that I'm talking about are controversial. I'm in no way saying that they will guarantee success. I'm just saying that they tend to be some interventions that are looked at when IVF isn't working. And so if you find yourself in the place where IVF hasn't worked, these are some things to just start researching and talking to your care team about, or doing more research and looking into. So let's get right to it. Retrieval. So what are some things to look at when your retrieval didn't work, which is such a disappointing thing? The first thing that is really getting a lot more mainstream now is, of course, to look at your protocol and make what I call protocol edits. Protocol edits. So you want to be thinking with your care team about what you want to change in your protocol to try to get more embryos that you can work with and try to have some success post retrieval round. And that usually means changing something up. And one of the main things that people use now, and a lot of people are using and have found success sometimes, is something called the growth hormone. So that's a human growth hormone. It is something that you can add even before you start a stimulation, and you can see if your particular RE uses it, or you can get a second opinion or a third opinion or fourth opinion with someone who uses that, or also has their own idea of how to edit your protocol with something that could help you get more follicles. The other thing is that is now very experimental, so this deserves an extra asterisk, is rapamycin. Rapamycin is really getting talked about a lot for particular egg quality. If you haven't listened to Dr. Amy's episode where she talks about supporting egg quality, that is a really good episode to go check out. She puts this on her top 5 list for supporting egg quality, improving supporting egg quality. So that's a great episode to check out. She talks about it then. Most REs aren't going to use this, but it's good to start just looking into. Of course, Dr. Amy does use this when appropriate. And it's just something that a lot of people are thinking about now and talking about, and worth just like having on your radar if your IVF retrieval didn't work. The other one that comes up a lot is for sperm, is a sperm DNA fragmentation analysis. So of course, if you're doing IVF, either with donor or your partner, if you have a male partner, there's been, I'm sure the sperm has been looked at and analyzed, but the sperm DNA fragmentation is a more thorough look. So that is something to consider. And or along with different sperm sorting techniques. So there's ways to select the most healthy and fittest sperm. And so if that wasn't part of your retrieval protocol, that's very much worth considering. And that is not so experimental, and hopefully that is something that your clinic either did automatically or will consider doing for the next retrieval round. And then the other thing that is great to look at, of course, is lifestyle changes and implementing new lifestyle changes for the retrieval process, pre-retrieval process. So if that means you are going to add some more fertility acupuncture, or you're going to change up your exercise routine, it's not saying that if you hadn't done that, that produced a failed cycle, of course, but that's always something to be looking into and thinking more about, and seeing if there's anything that you and your partner can do differently in terms of lifestyle that may help things. And then finally, the supplementation game. So if you haven't been taking supplements, and I'm talking, if you are on this journey with a partner, I'm talking to both you and your partner about supplementation. So you want to look at different supplements. So making sure you're on the recommended supplements. Your RE now might have some recommendations, or your acupuncturist might have some recommendations of things that are pretty typical that are taken now as supplements. One that Dr. Amy has talked about in the past is called NED. There's like the traditional supplements, just making sure that you and your partner are taking any of the recommended supplements if you hadn't done that in your previous cycle. Moving on to transfer. So if you find yourself listening to this and you have had a failed transfer or a pregnancy loss, these are some things to consider. A huge one is to think about, of course, editing your protocol. So maybe you want to think about a natural cycle if you're a candidate, or adding something to your cycle. If you had thin lining, looking at something like a Viagra or added estrogen, of course. And then a huge one that is not talked about a lot and should be talked about, because I see it so much. I'm not a doctor, but I see it so much in my practice. Lovenox. This is a little controversial. It is a blood thinner. And for whatever reason, anecdotally, people who start to, not always, of course, but people who have had failed transfers or not pregnancy losses, when they start adding Lovenox, for some reason, they tend to have improved success. And some REs will go ahead and add that to your protocol, at least in the United States, without you having some sort of blood clotting issue. Okay, I can name a couple off the top of my head that I know of here in the Bay Area that will just go ahead and add it now, when they weren't doing that a couple of years previously. Okay, and some REs will stay very far away from it because, of course, it's a blood thinner. So we're talking about some pretty controversial stuff here. So I just want to echo that again, but anecdotally, huge success with that. And then, of course, as I said in previous episodes, if you're having failed transfers, you want to get all the testing done that is out there for people who are about to go into a transfer. There's several of them. Check out that episode. I did a whole episode on this, but I highly recommend an RPL panel, repeated pregnancy loss panel, for people who've had both losses and failed. So if you've never been pregnant and you keep on having this horrible experience of a IVF transfer fail, I would be looking at an RPL, even though you haven't technically had a pregnancy loss, okay? And that isn't as controversial. Hopefully your RE will be able to run it's a pretty simple blood test. And unfortunately, for some reason, REs and doctors only go to the RPL when there's been, I think the standard is like 2 pregnancy losses for some reason. I don't understand this. This should be done right up front to see if there's any blood clotting issues that were undetected previously. And then again, you want to be looking into suppression meds. Perhaps there's some endometriosis that you didn't realize that's silent. Perhaps there's something else going on with the uterus that could benefit from a suppression medication along with your transfer. And then super controversial here is starting to think about and explore. I'm not saying pursue. Think about and explore immune protocols. So is there like an immune issue that is been kind of undetected previously where you could really benefit from an immune protocol, which of course is definitely not mainstream, and you would be wanting to speak with a reproductive immunologist, which I would love to do an episode on this show about. I would love to have one come on this show. There's not that many in the US. This is really controversial, but anecdotally, people who work with an RI is what they're called, have success when they were having 10 failures. So that's just a path to start digging into. You could think about also something like a baby aspirin, which is pretty typically now used. That's not as controversial. Things in the immunology route, reproductive immunology, would be something like prednisone. I mean, these are like inflammation barrier, inflammation reduction medications to work with inflammation. Of course, adding prednisone to a protocol, a lot of REs aren't going to do that, but some might. So those are the kinds of things. There's so many. I won't go into them in this episode, but starting to go down that path, and then looking at something a little bit less controversial for your protocol edit for your transfer would be something like a baby aspirin, which a lot of REs will do without a problem. Okay, that was a lot of information. So if you have a question, please write in alexandrapsychotherapy@gmail.com. Please check out my workshop for a comprehensive guide from overwhelm to confidence. If you want to work with me in California, you can find my information in the show notes. And until next time, remember, you are not alone.